I didn't catch messages. I noticed routines. My best friend from high school knew his schedule better than I did. Plans were made without me. He didn't cheat in chaos. He cheated in order. And that's when I realized I wasn't betrayed. I was replaced. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The pattern didn't announce itself all at once. It clarified slowly through repetition that no longer felt accidental. I stopped asking whether I was imagining things. The question became irrelevant. What mattered was consistency. Every adjustment pointed in the same direction. My presence no longer altered outcomes. Plans existed independently of my awareness. I learned about them after they were completed, never before. That detail stayed constant. There was no concealment involved. If I asked, he explained calmly, as if briefing someone external. His tone never shifted. It wasn't defensive or dismissive. It was procedural. I realized that inclusion had been replaced with notification. I was no longer part of the decision loop. I was an endpoint. The system didn't need my input to function. It accounted for me only as a variable to work around. That understanding arrived without emotion. It felt technical, almost neutral, like recognizing a process map that no longer contains your role. Once identified, it became visible everywhere, in conversations, in timing, in how space was allocated. Nothing dramatic confirmed it. The absence of contradiction did. I started noticing how little explanation was required anymore. Questions that once felt necessary no longer formed, not because answers were available, but because they were irrelevant. I observed my own behavior the way you watch a system stabilize. Inputs reduced, outputs remained consistent. The structure no longer depended on my engagement. I was present, but not consulted, and that distinction held steady. I noticed it in how time was allocated. Mornings unfolded without coordination. Evenings overlapped without intention. We shared space, not direction. There was no discomfort in it once I stopped resisting the configuration. Resistance implied an alternative still existed. It didn't. The process had already settled into its final form. I paid attention to details instead of meanings. Doors opening and closing, lights turned off without comment, schedules updating without notification. Each action reinforced the same conclusion. Nothing was being taken away, nothing was being added. I had simply been moved outside the operational core. That realization didn't demand a response. It required acknowledgement. Once acknowledged, it stopped pressing against me. The quiet felt intentional, not empty. I stopped trying to remember when it started. The exact point didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the structure no longer depended on me. I noticed how little effort it took to remain where I was. No decisions required my confirmation. No plans waited for my response. I existed in the margins without resistance. That position felt strangely stable, not temporary, not unresolved, finished. I understood that whatever role I thought I still had was historical. It belonged to an earlier version of the system. The current one functioned without it. Once that became clear, the tension dissolved. There was nothing to fix and nothing to recover, only a position to recognize. I stayed quiet because quiet was already built in. The realization didn't arrive as shock. There was no confrontation, no confession, no dramatic discovery. It arrived as a pattern. I noticed how their calendars aligned too perfectly, how conversations stopped when I entered the room, how he repeated phrases she used, word for word, as if rehearsed. Efficiency has a texture. It feels smooth, optimized, almost professional. What they had didn't feel passionate. It felt coordinated. I didn't ask questions. I watched. I listened. I let the information arrange itself. That's when I understood something important. This wasn't betrayal driven by desire. It was replacement driven by convenience. She fit the structure I had been sanding myself to match. She required less translation, less emotional negotiation, less disruption. I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity, the kind that settles in your chest like weight, not fire. I realized Jacob hadn't cheated on me in chaos. He had cheated in routine, in shared habits, in parallel lives. And suddenly, everything made sense. The shrinking wasn't accidental. It was preparation. I didn't confront them immediately. Control collapses fastest when it believes it's invisible. I kept behaving as expected. Calm, cooperative, predictable. Inside, I was mapping exits. I examined what Jacob valued most: reputation, composure, the image of rational decency. He wanted to be seen as fair, measured, reasonable. My friend valued belonging, being chosen, being correct. Their connection depended on remaining quiet, efficient, unquestioned. So I gave them exactly that. Silence, time, space. I let them grow comfortable. People are careless when they think they are undiscovered. I documented patterns, dates, overlaps, the subtle arrogance of people who believe they are smarter than emotion. I didn't plan revenge as destruction. I planned it as exposure, not explosive, but undeniable. Control hates unpredictability. Order collapses when observed publicly. I didn't want them ashamed. I wanted them clearly seen. There's a difference. I chose a gallery opening because art speaks without shouting. It invites witnesses. It frames truth without begging for belief. I invited them separately. Neutral messages, polite tone, no urgency. When they arrived and saw each other, I watched the calculations begin. Jacob tried to regain control through composure. My friend froze, waiting for instruction. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I stood in front of an installation about repetition and absence, and I spoke. I described a relationship built on adjustment, a woman learning to reduce herself for harmony, a man mistaking silence for compatibility. I spoke clinically, observationally. People listened because I wasn't asking for sympathy. I was presenting a case. Then I said the sentence I had rehearsed only once. He didn't cheat in a storm. He cheated in a schedule. The room understood. Order hates being named. Jacob tried to respond. He used calm language, reasonable words, the tone he had always trusted. But calm doesn't erase pattern. It highlights it. My friend avoided eye contact. She always had when things became real. I didn't look at either of them. I addressed the room. I talked about how control often masquerades as care, how order rewards compliance, how women are taught to mistake reduction for growth. This wasn't about love lost. It was about voice recovered. I didn't reveal messages. I didn't need evidence theatrics. Recognition is louder than proof. People saw what they needed to see because the structure had been explained. Jacob's reputation fractured not through scandal, but through understanding. That's harder to repair. Silence followed, not the kind that disciplines, the kind that releases. After that night, I didn't feel victorious. I felt spacious. My body expanded back into itself. My thoughts grew messy again. I stopped explaining my reactions. I stopped translating my needs. Control had required constant self-monitoring. Freedom felt disorienting at first. I missed the predictability. That surprised me. Then I understood. Order is addictive when you've been trained to depend on it. But addiction fades when the source is removed. My friend never contacted me again. Jacob sent one message. It was calm, apologetic, carefully worded. I didn't respond. Closure wasn't owed. I wasn't angry. Anger would have kept me tethered. I had already stepped out of the structure they shared. I was no longer an element to be managed. People asked if it hurt. Of course it did. But pain wasn't the lesson. Precision was. I learned how quietly people can be replaced when they make themselves small. I learned how easily control hides behind kindness. I learned that not all betrayals feel violent. Some feel administrative. That knowledge changed me. I stopped romanticizing stability. I stopped apologizing for intensity. Chaos isn't the opposite of order. Suppression is. I began choosing spaces that welcomed movement, people who didn't require explanation, relationships that didn't reward silence. My voice returned not as a scream, but as volume, as presence, as refusal to disappear politely. I became visible again, to myself first. Jacob thought he could replace me quietly. He thought efficiency would erase memory. He was wrong. I didn't destroy his life. I clarified it. I didn't take revenge. I took authorship. I am still too much, too emotional, too alive. But now I know the cost of shrinking, and I refuse to pay it again. I wasn't edited out. I stepped out of the frame and rewrote it. Being unforgettable isn't about noise. It's about leaving no doubt that you existed fully, loudly, and on your own terms.